The Cutter Generator HDA that we created earlier in the course is great for metal fractures and concrete and materials like that, but for glass fractures I tend to handle it a bit differently. Now Houdini does provide us with this RBD material fracture SOP, although I generally prefer to create my own Boolean cutters manually. I find that manually designing my own cutters gives me much better control over the final look, especially once you start receiving notes on your fracture from a supervisor or director. But that said, I do absolutely encourage you to experiment with this RBD material fracture SOP. In this case, I'm just using a 5x10 by 0.1 box for this glass pane example. And I'll set this RBD material fracture type from concrete to glass, and we'll connect our glass pane to that. And the first tab here gives you controls for the number of scatter points on the surface. By default, it's just scattering 1. You can increase the number of impact points if you'd like. So if we turn that up to 3, you can see we now have 3 impact points. You can also add your own scatter points to the fourth input of this SOP to define your own impact areas if you'd like. Moving on to the cracks tab. For the radial cracks, we have an option to control the number of those. Defaults to 20. If we turn it down to 10, you'll see we're getting fewer of those radial cracks going outward from that impact point. This also gives us options to vary that and to change the seed on the variance. For the concentric cracks, those are the ring cracks, we have this control for the minimum width. So if we turn that down, you'll see that the width of those circular cracks gets much smaller and they're a lot closer together here. And this impact spread controls how far out those ring cracks are allowed to spread from the center of the impact point. So if you turn that up, you'll see those ring cracks spread out a little bit further. And you'll notice that these aren't very perfect rings. There's a whole bunch of discontinuity in terms of the shapes of these fractures. And those rings aren't forming perfectly continuous rings, and you can use these discontinuity controls here to affect that. So if we turn this discontinuity size way down, you can see those rings are spreading out a whole lot farther. But I do find this a bit of an unintuitive way to control the features of your fracture, which is just another reason that I like to set this up manually instead of using this tool. But before we take a look at doing it manually, we can also take a look at the chipping option here. So if you enable that, you can see it's adding subfractures to our pieces of glass here. This ratio will control how many of those pieces are subfractured. So if you turn that down, we'll get a whole lot less subfracturing happening. And if we turn that way up, then you'll see more of those pieces are being subfractured. This overall seed will just give you variations on those chipping features. And this corner ratio is similar to that overall ratio, but controls the likelihood that corners are chipped off of your geometry. So turning that up results in more of these pieces having their corners chipped off and generating a whole lot more glass shards in the process. Now moving on to the detail controls, I'm going to drop in an exploded view to get a closer look at the detail on these cracks. So you can see this is pretty high resolution now, and if you don't need all of that detail, you can just raise this detail size here. A lot of this is pretty intuitive. We have some fall-offs from the origin of the impact points and from the border of the surface, and some noise controls that should look pretty familiar. And we can also turn on convex decomposition here if we want this SOP to output proxy geometry as well. So you don't have to do that in a separate process. One thing worth mentioning regarding detail sizes is that if you're using this SOP to create glass pieces for a glass debris sim, maybe some instanced particles or something like that, then you might not want them to be very high res. You might assume, okay, this looks so much better if it's got this much detail in there, but once you start attaching that to thousands and thousands of packed pieces of geometry, it doesn't make sense, and it's very wasteful if it's just going to be, this size on your screen. You're just going to make any caching and rendering that much heavier unnecessarily with all this detail that you ultimately won't see.